You're welcome to this channel once again. I want to talk about vendor management with COBIT 2019. All right. I often say in COBIT classes that COBIT is many things to many people. All right. And I want to look today at the application of COBIT 2019 in management of vendor. Okay. Let's look at APO 10, manage vendors. Okay. APO is align, plan, and organize in COBIT. The purpose of APO 10 is to optimize available I&T capabilities to support the I&T strategy and roadmap, minimize the risk associated with non-performing or non-compliant vendors, and ensure competitive pricing. So in simple layman language, what that is saying is that the purpose of this objective is to ensure that you don't lose out in your pricing with pricing of vendor contracts. Okay, I was looking at a vendor contract this morning online, and the moment I saw it, I said, "Look, this is a scam, man. This is a scam. This can't be real." All right, but unfortunately, all right, it was reality. So clients, businesses do lose out when it comes to pricing of vendor contracts. Okay, so competitive pricing. You are able to ensure that your vendors perform, all right? They deliver the service expected of them. They are compliant with laws and regulations that binds you as an organization. So there's something that is called vicarious liability. You don't want your vendor to run into trouble, then the regulatory authorities or the government are coming for you. All right. So you also want to ensure that your vendors are compliant with legal and regulatory requirements. Okay, so you are able to also minimize vendor risk, and you are able to optimize your I&T, information and technology capabilities, and you are able to drive your I&T strategy, information and technology strategy to enable the fulfillment of your business objectives. All right. In subsequent videos, I'll be talking about enterprise goals and alignment goals. But for now, let me jump to the components, the components of a governance system, how we can use the components of a governance system to manage vendor. All right, so the first component we are looking at is process. And in COBIT, process can be characterized, okay, can be broken down into management priorities. Management priorities can be broken down into activities. All right, so the first management priorities we are looking at is APO 10.01, identify and evaluate vendor relationships and contracts. All right, and under this, under the identify and evaluate vendor relationship and contracts, we have 5 activities that COBIT recommended you are supposed to have in place as an organization. All right, 5 activities you're supposed to have in place. All right, number 1, continuously scan the enterprise landscape in search of new partners and vendors that can provide complementary capabilities and support the realization of the I&T strategy, roadmap, and enterprise objectives. What is that one talking about? All right, you need to continuously look for new vendors, even for your existing processes and activities. All right, there's what I call vendor obsolescence. All right, it's also possible that your vendor become obsolete over time. Okay, so they get rusted, kind of. So that's why you need to keep on searching. All right, so you keep on being on the lookout for new partners, new vendors, new relationships that can help to drive your I&T strategy. Number 2, establish and maintain criteria related to type, significance, and criticality of vendors and vendor contracts, enabling the focus on preferred and important vendors. So you need to have, process ranking. You need to have vendor ranking. You need to have ranking of vendor contracts, so that you know the contracts, you know the vendors, you know the processes you're going to give the utmost attention to as an organization. Okay, so that is very important. In some organizations, they have what they call pre-qualification of vendors. So they have this criteria which they have already set. you have to be in the pool of the vendor pool before you can even be considered for any form of contract or whatsoever. So we need to have these pre-qualification criteria defined by the organization. Now we need to be able to rank the contracts, the vendors within the organization based on the contributions to the business objectives. Number 3, identify, record, and categorize existing vendors and contracts according to defined criteria to maintain a detailed register of preferred vendors that need to be managed carefully. So this is still talking about your vendor pool. So you need to have a record. Do you have a record of your existing current contracts, current vendors? Do you have a pool for that? So if we ask your contract manager or head of IT, just how many IT contracts are running right now? Can we have a figure? Can we have a number? All right. If we are told to retrieve all the existing running contracts, do we have a file for them, either logical file or physical file? All right, that is what number 3 is talking about. Number 4, establish and maintain vendor and contract evaluation criteria to enable overall review and comparison of vendor performance in a consistent way. SLA, service level agreement. That is what that's talking about. So it's not just enough to sign a contract with a vendor. You need to have a way to quarterly, biannually, annually, at plan intervals, like ISO will say. All right, measure, determine, evaluate the performance, the contributions of that vendor relative to the agreed thresholds. Number 5, periodically evaluate and compare the performance of existing and alternative vendors to identify opportunities or a compelling need to reconsider current vendor contracts. So you need to be able to look at, what is happening in your organization, what is happening elsewhere in a related organization also. All right. What is the turnaround time of your vendor? What is the turnaround time of the vendor working for your competitors in the same industry, in another industry? All right, so you need to be able to get this data to be able to compare. All right, if you have a particular contract that is, a particular project that or service or processes that are being managed by multiple vendors, which is possible if the vendor is the business is that big, or the process is that complex. So you have a particular process, all right, that is being managed by multiple vendors, maybe in different geographical locations. We should be able to compare, all right, the performance of those vendors over time, so that we'll be able to know who is lagging and who is leading. Okay, so this is also very important. Now, so those are the 5 activities that that COBIT 2019 has recommended for us to implement in the management of vendors. So do you have these 5 activities running? If yes, good. If no, you have to follow COBIT recommendations and implement these 5 activities. All right, then the second management practice, APO 10.0, to select vendors. All right. Under these select vendors, you have 7 activities that COBIT recommended for you to implement. Note that we also have, I think it's important for me to also mention example my metrics. All right. So COBIT, for each of the management practice, COBIT has recommended metrics for us to actually use to evaluate. And this is important for auditors too. Auditors about auditing the processes. For example, identify and evaluate vendor relationship and contracts. All right, you have metrics that you can use, KPI. All right, percent of defined evaluation criteria achieved for existing suppliers and contracts. How many of the vendors you already have actually met what I can call your pre-qualification criteria? Or the company is higher because it was the MD that recommended the company, or it was the chief procurement officer that brought the company. All right, what is the basis that was used to select the vendor? How many of the, so you have 10 vendors right now. How many of those 10 actually met the pre-qualification criteria? That is what that is saying. And it's a very important metric for you to know where you are as an organization to determine the maturity of your procurement process. All right. Then the second one, percent of alternative suppliers providing equivalent services of existing supplier contracts. So do you have backup? So that's redundancy. All right. So how many of your processes, how many of your contracts, all right, especially operational contracts that is ongoing, all right, that you have backup for? Do you have alternative suppliers? All right, in case our primary supplier fails, we can always go back to the secondary supplier and we are able to still meet the recovery time objective or the turnaround time of that particular process. All right, so the second one, management practice, select vendors. All right, look at the metrics we have here. Number of identified gaps between the selected suppliers' offerings and the needs specified in the request for proposal. So the request for proposal actually is a documentation of your requirements as an organization, your needs. So we have 10 vendors. How many of those vendors, all right, services actually meet the requirements in the RFP, or were the requirements in the RFP overruled by somebody in the organization that has the power to overrule it? All right, this is a serious one for auditors, for regulators, and for implementers also to also watch out for. All right, the second one be percent of stakeholders satisfied with supplier. So if you take a satisfaction survey of the stakeholders, internal and external, how many of them are happy with the with the delivery, with the services of the vendor? So that is also a KPI we can use to know whether we are getting APO 10.02 right, selection of vendors. Okay, so let's look at the activities we are supposed to roll out for this 10.02. All right. Number one, review all requests for information and requests for proposals to ensure that they clearly define requirements, e.g. enterprise requirement for security and privacy of information, operational business and I&T processing requirement, priority for service delivery. You don't want your vendor to run you into trouble. So right from the request for information, which is used to solicit information from vendors, all right, and the request for proposal, which is used to state the need of the client organization, let the vendor know in advance that you place a lot of emphasis on security, privacy, all right, risk management, excellent service delivery. So right from these documentations, start communicating with your potential vendors about how serious you care for security, privacy, and excellence. Okay, and include the procedure to clarify requirements. The request for information and the request for proposals should allow vendors sufficient time to prepare their proposals and should clearly define award criteria. Let us know in advance, okay? So the financial metrics, the technical metrics should be clearly defined. The decision process should be clearly defined. Shouldn't be shrouded in secrecy. This is where many organizations get a vendor, especially from the selection. A lot of time, people get it wrong right from the selection. You get the wrong vendor, then you're going to get the wrong service. All right. So, number one, very important, very germane for every organization across all industries. Number two, evaluate RFIs. All right. Request for information and request for proposals in accordance with the approved evaluation process or criteria, and maintain documentary evidence of the evaluation. Verify the references of candidate vendors. So, of course, when the clients are responding to the request for information, responding to the request for proposals, they are expected to include references to sites, to organizations that they work for in the past, okay? Name of the company, what they did for the company, all right, name of contact person, email of contact person, phone number of contact person. A very good vendor selection process is expected to have all these information. So, so review the request for information, the request for proposal, all right, based on the evaluation criteria that you have set, and also review the responses to these request for information and the request for proposals in accordance with the evaluation criteria. Number two. So number three now, select the vendor that best fits the request for proposal. Man, this is a challenge for many organizations because at this point, so many factors now play, comes to play, okay? Things like political factor, all right? Somebody knows somebody and things like that. So, but you have to select the vendor that you know that can best deliver that particular service that is about to be outsourced. And of course, document the basis for choosing that particular vendor. Then you can sign the contract. Wonderful. Number four, in the specific case of software acquisition, include and enforce the rights and obligations of all parties in the contractual terms. These rights and obligations may include ownership and licensing of intellectual property. Who owns the software? Okay, we just got the software. Is the software our own or that of the vendor? We need or the OEM. So we need to clarify this clearly. What are we paying for? All right, are we paying for this entire service, entire software and the source code? All right, everything about the software, or we are paying to use the software. We have to clarify this. All right, maintenance issues should also be clarified. Warranties, arbitration procedures in case things get messy. What do we do? Who do we resort to? Upgrades, terms. Okay, of course, the software will need patching, we need updates here and there. We need to address that in the contract. All right, fee for purpose, including security, privacy, escrow. What's escrow? Now, this is very important, especially for very big projects, very big software acquisition. All right, you are buying a software that is not your own as an organization, and that software is very crucial to your operations, man. You need to ensure you have escrow agreement, which is that there's a third party that the two parties agree to keep the copies of the source code with, in case something happens to the vendor organization. All right, the vendor organization has gone out of business. We have escrow to fall back on. All right, so that is what number three is saying. For software acquisition, software development lifecycle, you've got to be very, very careful. All right, cross the T's and dot the I's of the contract between you and the vendor organization. Number five, in the specific case of acquisition of development resources, include and enforce the rights and obligations of all parties in the contractual terms. All right, these rights and obligations may include ownership, licensing of intellectual properties, fee for purpose, including development methodologies. If they are going to code for you, that's what that is talking about. All right, if they are going to code for you, you better, all right, what we'll say in Nigeria, you have to shine your eyes. All right, the contract must be very thorough, must be very stringent, must address testing. Guys, you can't code for us, you can't develop for us a software that is not properly tested. So you have to do the different kind of tests that need to be done. Quality assurance tests, user acceptance tests, UAT, and the rest of them. And of course, you have to keep records of those tests for us to see. Quality management processes, software code review, software testing, include required performance criteria, performance reviews, basis for payment, guarantees, arbitration procedures, HR management, compliance with enterprise policies. You have to ensure you have all these in place in the contract if you are hiring a vendor to develop the software for you. Number six, obtain legal advice on resource development acquisition agreement regarding ownership and licensing of intellectual property. These are realities. All right, you are hiring a vendor. This is the software we need, and you give the software requirements to the vendor. Who is the owner? All right, so you have to get your lawyers involved, the vendors' lawyers, everybody have to meet and agree on ownership. If not, there's going to be a problem in the future. Number 7, in the specific case of acquisition of infrastructure, all right, facilities and related services include and enforce the rights and obligations of all parties in the contractual terms. So you are hiring a vendor, come and set up a data center for us. You have to have a detailed and stringent contract. That's what that is saying. These rights and obligations may include service levels, maintenance procedures, access controls, security, privacy, performance review, basis for payment, and arbitration procedures. These are the 7 activities under APO 10.02 select vendors. Okay. The third management practice is APO 10.03, manage vendor relationships and contracts. So now we have signed the contracts, we are now partners in progress. So we have to keep the wheels of progress moving. All right, here example metrics, percent of third-party suppliers who have contracts defining control requirements. So you need to be able to let your vendors know that there are control issues, there are security issues. So it's not just deliver the service securely. All right, number 2B, number of formal disputes with suppliers. So you're supposed to have a register to be, cataloging the disputes you have with your vendors, the nature of the disputes, the timing, and the rest. All right. Number of supplier review meetings is also a KPI for this, for vendor relationship management. So are you meeting regularly with your vendors who have ongoing contracts with you? D, percent of dispute resolved amicably in a reasonable time frame. You can see these KPIs are very important in vendor management. All right, number 1, so we have 8 activities here. Number 1, assign relationship owners for all vendors and make them accountable for the quality of services provided. So for all key contracts, you have somebody internally in charge to manage the relationship. That's what that number 1 is saying. Number 2, specify a formal communication and review process, including vendor interactions and schedules. How are we going to be communicating with the vendors? Email, if it is email, which email? Phone number, which phone number? All right, what is the frequency of communication? So all these have to be determined. Number 2. Number 3, agree on, manage, maintain, and renew formal contracts with the vendor. Ensure that contracts conform to enterprise standards and legal and regulatory requirements. So once you sign the contracts must be managed. All right, the contract must be maintained. And if we are at the end of the contract, and of course we have to renew the contract if we are satisfied and we want to keep the relationship going. All right, and we must do all this within the framework of the laws and regulations. Number 4, include provisions in contracts with key service vendors for review of the vendor site and internal practices and controls by management or independent third parties. That's what they call in CISA, Certified Information System Auditor. They call it rights to audit clause. So you include a right to audit clause. If I'm giving you a job, I have a right to come and audit how you do my job on your site. I need to check internal practices in your client organization to see whether I'm safe or not. So we have to agree on independent audit and assurance controls of the operational environments of vendors providing our services to confirm that agreed requirements are being adequately addressed. Number 5, use established procedures to deal with contract disputes. So we need to have a clause in the vendor contracts that address how we are going to manage disputes, because definitely disputes are going to come up. So are we going to law courts? Are we going to do arbitration? All right. So all those have to be written down. Whenever possible, first use effective relationships and communications to overcome service problems. Number 6, define and formalize roles and responsibilities for each service vendor. We have several vendors combined to provide a service. Consider allocating a lead contractor role to one of the vendors to take responsibility for an overall contract. So you have a complex scenario which is managed by various vendors. So that what that is saying, that you need to assign somebody as a lead vendor for such complex processes or complex contracts, so that we know who is in charge, who can issue orders, who can bring everybody to the line, who can take responsibility for the delivery of the services. So we need to everybody need to have their defined roles and responsibility among our vendors. Number 7, evaluate the effectiveness of the relationship and identify necessary improvements. So apart from the vendor output, you also need to evaluate your relationship with the vendor and determine whether it needs improvement or not. Then number 8, define, communicate, and agree on ways to implement required improvements to the relationship. All right. So we also need to communicate ways of improving the relationship, all right, within our organization and also to the vendor organization. So that is what ISO will call improvements, continuous improvements. All right. So these are the 8 activities under manage vendor relationships and contracts. Okay. Then we also have another management practice, manage vendor risk. Okay, APO 10.04, vendor risk. Look at the metrics we have here: frequency of risk management sessions with supplier. B, number of risk-related events leading to service incidents. C, percent of risk-related incidents resolved acceptably within acceptable time and acceptable costs. So managing vendor risk, there are 3 activities here that we should take note of. So number 1 activity, when preparing the contract, provide for potential service risk by clearly defining service requirements, including software escrow agreement. I talked about that. All right, you can use software escrow agreement to manage the risk of the vendor packing up. So you have access to the source code of the software. All right, alternative vendors. So in case the primary vendor has problem, you can switch to the alternative vendor, or standby agreements to mitigate possible vendor failure. So you need to be able to have foreseen that there can be possible vendor failure. So what should we do in case there is a vendor failure? So security and protection of intellectual property, privacy, any legal or regulatory requirements. So factor risk management into the contract service signing and monitoring. Number 2, identify, monitor, and where appropriate, manage risk relating to the vendor's ability to deliver services efficiently, effectively, securely, confidentially, reliably, and continually. Integrate critical internal IT management processes with those of their source service providers, covering, for example, performance and capacity planning, chain management, and configuration management. So your culture must be diffused into the culture of the vendor. So integrate. So you have implemented COBIT, you have implemented IT, you have implemented ISO 20000. Make it a requirement that whoever is going to work for the organization is also going to apply all these best practices. So integrate, all right, your internal IT management processes with that of the vendor. So if they are not ready to do that, okay, then that means they are not. They shouldn't be the vendors you should be hiring. All right. So you don't want your vendor to be a source of risk to you. Number 3, assess the larger ecosystem of the vendor and identify, monitor, and where appropriate, manage risk related to the subcontractors and upstream vendors, influencing the vendor's ability to deliver service efficiently, effectively, securely, reliably, and continually. So look at the larger ecosystem. So PESTEL will help you, the political, economic, social, technological, environmental, and legal climate of the vendor. You should be concerned. SWOT analysis of the vendor, the strength, the weakness, opportunities and threats of the vendor. So look at the vendor, beyond the premises of the vendor. Look at the environment in which the vendor is working and operating, and you do your risk assessment so that you can be able to predict on time what could go wrong and which can hinder the ability of your vendor to actually effectively and efficiently deliver on for you. So that is what that number 3 is talking about. So manage vendor risk, APO 10.04. All right, do we still have more management practices here? Yes, another one, APO 10.05, monitor vendor performance and compliance. Monitor your SLA. So look at the example metrics, number of service breaches to IRT related services caused by suppliers. If vendor failed, then your process failed. Log it. B, percent of suppliers meeting agreed requirements. Let's look at the 6 activities under this management practice. Number 1, request independent reviews of vendor internal process, practices and controls if necessary. Right? I said that is right to audit. Right to audit clause. Include it in the contract. Number 2, define and document criteria to monitor vendor performance align with service level agreement. Ensure that the vendor regularly and transparently reports on agreed criteria. So there should be maybe daily reports, weekly reports, monthly report, quarterly report, for us to be able to know whether the vendor is meeting up or not. Number 3, monitor and review service delivery to ensure that the vendor is providing an acceptable quality of service, meeting requirements, and adhering to contract conditions and requirements. Number 4, review vendor performance and value for money. Value for money, all right, that's a management time. Are you getting value for your money? So you can use end value analysis, EVA, okay, in project management for that. So the money you are spending on the contract, are you getting value in return? Ensure that the vendor is reliable, competitive, compare with alternative vendors and market conditions. Number 5, monitor and evaluate externally available information about the vendor and the vendor's supply chain. Yeah, so it's not just the vendor alone. You need to look at the supply chain of who is supplying the vendor, right? Is there a political issue that can affect the vendor's ability to perform? What about the currency exchange, all right, in the country where the vendor is domiciled, all right? Forex fluctuations, all right, social arrests. So as much as possible, keep your eyes on as much information as possible about your vendor. Okay, number 6, record and assess, review results periodically and discuss them with the vendor to identify needs and opportunities for improvement. So these are the 6 activities under monitor vendor performance and compliance. Okay, so which means basically we have 5 management practices under process in management of the vendor using COBIT, 5 management practices. And under those 5 management practices, we have looked at various activities that COBIT expect us to implement. So you as a management staff of your organization, okay, or an IT staff in your organization, how far have you gone in the implementation of all these management practices and activities? And that is not just all, no. COBIT also make recommendations on organizational structure. Now, like I said, we have 10 management practices. You can see them here, APO 10.01 to APO 10.05. COBIT also make a recommendation for each of the management practices. For you have to assign accountability to one person, all right, and responsibility to others to ensure that that management practice is running effectively in the organization. For example, identify and evaluate vendor relationship and contract. COBIT says your I&T governance board, so the leadership of the organization is accountable. All right, then the responsibility can fall to the CIO, the CTO, all right, the CDO, Chief Digital Officer, and IT administration. I think that makes sense a lot. Select vendors. Accountability is still the leadership of the organization. INT governance board. All right, while responsibility can be shared across all these individuals and units that have the R. So head development, head IT operations, head IT administration, service manager, they can share responsibility for selecting vendor, but ultimately INT, Information and Tech Governance Board, is accountable. Manage vendor relationship and contracts. Look at it again. INT Governance Board is still accountable. According to COBIT, the responsibility can be shared. Manage vendor risk. All right. IIT Governance Board is accountable. Responsibilities can be shared, all right, by Chief Risk Officer, Chief Information Officer, Chief Tech Officer, and so on. All right. Lastly, monitor vendor performance and compliance. All right. COBIT says is the leadership. IIT Governance Board is accountable. Responsibility can be shared. So what we're saying is that these activities, these management practices should not just be established without having people, individuals, all right, responsible and accountable for their execution, for their implementation. All right, look at the third component, information flows and items. This is talking about information that we need to manage contracts, vendors effectively and efficiently in our respective organization. For example, you need to be able to, you need vendor contracts. All right, you need vendor contracts, which will help us to create vendor catalog, all right, which will help us to update, all right, revisions to those vendor contracts, and which will also help us to rank the vendors in terms of significance. Okay, so that is related to APO 10.01. All right, documentations, information we need for APO 10.02, select vendors. We need high-level acquisition development plan. How do you get your software? Planning for system development plan. How do we acquire software? How do we develop software in the organization? That's what that is talking about. Then we use that to create, all right, request for information, request for proposal, all right, request for information and request for proposal evaluations, decision results after we have done vendor evaluation. All these are information that we need. All right, APO 10.3, all right, we need approved acquisition plan. All right, which we use to produce results and suggested improvements, communication and review process, vendor roles and responsibility. All right, to manage vendor risk, what do we need? Risk analysis reports, risk profile report for stakeholders, result of third-party risk assessment. So as 31,000 will pay us out here. So we need to do risk assessment on the processes to be outsourced, risk assessment on the vendors that have shown interest and so on. So this will help us to identify vendor delivery risk, identify contract requirements to minimize risk. So once we understand the risk, we will now know the contractual terms to specify to manage those risks. The APO 10.05, monitor vendor performance and compliance. All right, we need information such as vendor compliance monitoring criteria, vendor compliance monitoring review results, evidence that you're actually monitoring the vendor's performance. So these are information required according to this component C, information flows and items. All right. Then skills. Look at these. I love these. People skills and competence. The fourth component. To manage vendors in organization, you need contract management skills. So if you don't have that, you've got to get it. All right. You need purchasing skills. You need sourcing skills. So we need to ensure. So we need to work with HR and management to ensure that all these skills are available in the organization. The fifth component, all right, for managing contracts and managing vendors is policies and procedures. So we need to have IT procurement policy in place. We need to have third-party IT service delivery management policy in place. So it's not compulsory that it has to be specific, specifically as it is named there, but at least you need to have policy documents that help us, that will meet all these policy description, align principles and procedures for procuring IT hardware, software, and host solutions. If I'm going to buy software as head of IT, I should be guided by policy. All right, I'm going to develop software, all right, internally or external. Now, from vendors, I'm going to contract vendors to develop software for the organization. I should be guided by policy. So we should have those policies in place. That is what he is saying. All right. All right. The F component, culture, ethics, and behavior. So it's not just the technology, it's not just the procedures. What about cultural issues? That's one thing I like about COBIT. So we need to also ensure that we have the right culture, right, to be able to ensure vendor management is done right in our organization. So build and manage an ecosystem of vendors that can assist the organization in its digital transformation and innovation. Continuously scan the landscape in search of new and effective partners that can fit into your culture. So there's a very organization where things are done, anyhow, negligently. The maturity level is very low. If you scale them on maybe on the capability maturity level, maybe they are on level 1, and your organization is in level 3. All right, the culture will not fit. All right, so you need to scan your internal culture. You need to scan the culture of the intending, all right, or potential contractors also, to see whether the culture can blend together. So this is also very, very important in management of vendor risk. All right. The last component is services, infrastructure, and applications. So here they are recommending for us the enterprise architecture that can help you to manage your vendors better. So as much, if it's possible, get a contract management system. If it's possible, get third-party assurance services, right? Third-party, so you can, like I talked about, right to audit. So you can get an audit organization to audit your vendor. They give you a report so that you know whether you can continue the relationship with them or not. So thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Once again, my name is Akinwale Akindia. All right. If you have not subscribed to this channel, try and do so now so that you can be able to get more videos from me. I'm still going to produce more videos on how we can use COBIT in managing other areas of interest to IT and related organizations. Thank you.